Hello, this is Taylor Ellwood with Magical Experiments Podcast, and I'm thrilled because today I have Byron Ballard here with me. Byron, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and where we can find you online.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Byron Ballard. I live in Western North Carolina. I teach a lot about Appalachian folkways and folk magic, but I also do a lot of other things. I'm a farmer and a gardener. You can find me online on Facebook far too often. Also on Insta and Twitter, though I still haven't figured out how quite to use Instagram. It's still fun. And my website is myvillagewitch.com.
Okay, welcome. Yeah, I spend too much time on Facebook too. I'm trying to cut that habit down a bit.
Me too, me too. I've got more books to write, and I can't do that while I'm digesting stuff on Facebook.
No. So what are some of the books that you've written?
I've written 3 books on Appalachian folkways and folk magic. The first one was in 2012, and it's called Stalbs and Ditchwater. The second one is Aspidity and Madstones. And then I did 2 other books and then came back to Appalachian folkways for the book that came out from Llewellyn in February, which is called Roots, Branches, and Spirits, the Folkways and Witchery of Appalachia.
Excellent. And for people who are interested in those books, they're going to be in the show notes with links so that you can go and check them out. So let's talk a little bit about Appalachian folk magic for people who don't even know what that is. What is it?
Well, I have these 3 books that you can read.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Excuse me. Appalachian folk magic is a magical practice and tradition that is deeply rooted in the Appalachian Mountains. It changes because it comes down family lines. It changes from family to family, cove to cove, so that I try to be pretty specific about what I practice is Southern Appalachian folk magic. So it's going to have less of an influence of, say, the Dutch tradition, Pennsylvania Dutch, because we're farther down there is a little bit of that influence. And of course, the Appalachian region is very long, and it goes all the way into the deep South and then ends up all the way up in Canada. And if you look at the way we were before continental drift, those same mountains are in Ireland and Scotland. So they've been around for a long, long time. And the folk magic comes down to us for the most part. I'm so cagey now about doing absolutes about anything, but it comes down to us for the most part through a Protestant Christian filter. And there are several major influences, but one of them, of course, are the Scots Irish people who came here at the around the turn of the 1700s, and that's a huge influence. And also, we are in Cherokee country, so that's a big influence too.
That's interesting then, because really it's kind of what I'm hearing is that it's really a confluence of different spiritual paths and traditions that come together and then become its own unique thing, and kind of a, as you said, a familial line then as well.
Yes, absolutely. And when I first started writing about it, in 2008, I think, I was invited to do this colloquium at Harvard called Forging Folklore, where I did your standard 20-minute academic paper on this practice. And at that time, I wasn't sure I wanted to teach it outside of the culture, because our culture is denigrated all the time. I just wasn't sure about it, but I really wanted to kind of get it down on paper, because it felt like it was mostly a verbal tradition, an oral tradition that was being lost as the culture was being integrated from a lot of outside forces. And then, like everybody who does a book tour, I did a book tour with my first book, and I found all these people that still do all this stuff. The only difference is they don't hang out a shingle, they don't have a Facebook page, they're not selling curios and tinctures. They are just the person in their community that people go to when they have thrush, when they're about to have a baby, all that stuff. So it really is, it's a long-standing and very alive tradition.
So when those people saw that book come out, how did they respond to seeing that?
Well, one of the first places I went was to visit friends in West Virginia and to do like a little workshop. And it was also kind of a listening tour because I wanted to hear what other people were doing. And here is the magical thing about West Virginia. They also have Google. So we were being really careful not to use the word witch, which is pretty, almost nobody uses it in this folk tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't use that word at all. And yet everybody was thinking of coming to this afternoon tea thing with me, Googled me, and who am I? I'm the village witch. So half of them didn't come. Half the people who said they were coming didn't come. And then I started unloading all this mason jars full of stuff. And people were calling their friends who had refused to come and saying, you need to get down here because she does exactly the same thing you do, or that your grandma did, or that your aunt whatever did. And so I got half of them came back because it is so standard in this region. But people assumed that when they heard the word witch that I was going to be doing something that was very non-traditional. So there's some suspicion, or there was early on. I think most people now who know me know that I'm pretty traditional at heart, even though I'm still kind of digging around for what the roots of it all are. So I don't get too much of that, but it really just takes sitting down with somebody and actually using my real accent instead of the accent I use on shows like this. And they know immediately that, I'm from here, I'm of here. And that's helpful.
So what's your real accent then? If this isn't the one, I'm just curious.
Well, I have a master's degree in theater. And one of the things that is required for people like me is that I be able to code switch into a more neutral accent.
Right.
So I spent years and years getting rid of my accent. And now it's been years, it's been at least a decade that I've been trying to get it back. So
that's got to be a challenge.
It is. It is a challenge, and it's also a challenge because I haven't returned to that accent full time. I'm still code switching when I need to,
right?
Because I found that in some cases, if I do my full on native accent, people don't understand what I'm saying. So I'm pretty careful about that. Another thing that I do that your listeners might want to check out is I do a podcast with a friend of mine, Alicia, called Weird Mountain Gals. And that's a riff on all those old bluegrass groups that were called like the Clinch Mountain Boys or the Foggy Bottom Boys, so we are the Weird Mountain Gals, and it's full on Appalachia, and we tell stories and we sing songs, and we use our native accents because the demographic that loves that podcast wants to hear that. They want to hear what sounds like home to them.
I think that makes sense, but it must be an interesting challenge. I mean, you're also dealing in a very real sense with reclaiming a key part of identity. Absolutely. With that. And just my own experience, I think, identity plays a fundamental role in magical work. What we identify with becomes part of the magical work, right? It has to.
Yeah. There was a hot minute where everybody was all about the biosphere and plunging all of your magical work into the land that you're in and on. And I was astounded that people didn't already do that. How do you do magic without doing it with and in the land you live on? But apparently lots of people didn't, and many people still don't. But that's the foundation of everything I do, is based in the land here.
I think that's an interesting observation, and I would agree with that. I mean, I think part of it is that from my own observations, magic has become a very intellectual exercise in a lot of ways. It's for some people it's become very psychological. Even for other people, it's more about going into perhaps like working with the spirits, but working with it in a way where they're trying to get into the other, as opposed to really working with what's around them. So and then of course, I mean, I also think that there's a very real challenge of the fact that in some cases people don't even live in an environment where they can connect with the earth in a meaningful way. Like if you live in a city, it's just not the same as if you live in a country.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Okay,
it
all right,
is.
great. Now I'd love to hear that then. Thank
I
you.
I was talked into doing a class at FairyCon, which you had Fairy World, I think, on the West Coast, and we had FairyCon, which was a big 3-day festival where everybody pretended to be fairies, and they brought me in. I'm not sure why they brought me in to talk about actually working with land spirits and working with what we refer to as the good neighbors.
Mhm.
And and I casually made this comment that I had heard someone local say they had been to Japan, but they felt like they never really connected with Japan because they got off at the tarmac at the airport, they got into a car, they were always on concrete or macadam streets, and then they got back in the plane and they flew away and they never connected with Japan. And I thought that's just ridiculous. It's like saying if you and I are both wearing our heavy winter coats and we
Mhm.
hug each other, that we didn't actually hug because we weren't naked. And I think so often we are living in this kind of fantasy that an urban environment doesn't have the kind of deep connection to the earth. Or let me even back up from urban environment, but the human built environment doesn't have that. And it absolutely does. It's the problem is blockage with us. It's not blockage with the spirit world, which is there all the time. And so I talk about places like New York where, yes, Central Park is amazing, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm
Mhm.
talking about skyscrapers and crosswalks and
Oh,
what
wow.
happens with steam when steam comes out from underneath a building. And
Huh.
all of that has recourse to magic, and it's all about energy, and it's all about the spirit of place. And if we are waiting, sorry, I'm on a soapbox now.
No,
If
go for
we
it.
are if we are waiting for that mythical time when we move to the country and we live on the land to practice magic, then we've wasted potentially our entire lives, because the most of us will ever do is move to the suburbs. That's probably the best most of us can hope for, is a great big backyard. And
Mhm.
if you are waiting until you can range the hills, then you may be waiting forever to do magic, while the magic is right there under your nose and literally under your feet.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I mean, it also brings up I think you bring up a really valid point that, I mean, we are always connected to the earth. The environment might be different, but if we're just letting our perspective of that environment stop us from connecting with what's there, then that's a limitation we're imposing on ourselves more so than anything else.
Well, absolutely. And right before the show started, we were talking about what's happening with the climate. So if you can't be resilient about the way land is changing and you can't perceive the energy of the land as it changes, then you're probably going to be out of luck. Let's
Mhm.
just be clear about that. If you're waiting for the beautiful spring rains or the autumn monsoons or the snow or whatever thing it is that really deeply connects you in, then you may be waiting forever as the climate changes and shifts.
Yeah. So beyond tuning into the land in the way that you've suggested, what are some other things that people could be doing differently that perhaps they're not doing when you look at modern witchcraft or modern magic, such as it is?
They could be practicing witchcraft. They could be practicing magic. The thing that is most distressing, I think, like I'm a big fan. I'm not on TikTok, but I'm a big fan of the TikTok witches because people they'll be all pearl clutchy about, oh no, the TikTok witches, they're going to hex the moon. Oh no, the TikTok witches, they're going to hex the fae. Oh no. And I just go, y'all get real, because you know as well as I do, when we were coming up, and I'll put you in that collective we did all that crazy crap. We did
Mhm.
it. It's 5 minutes to midnight, and we are digging under the bed to find the little Ouija board kit that we got. so that we can at midnight call in whatever, a demon, a serpent, a dead person, whatever it is we're going to call in. We all did that. We all did stupid, crazy stuff because that's how we learned magic. We learned it through trial and error, and that's how they're learning it. But we didn't have video. We didn't make video of ourselves doing something that in 10 years' time, somebody's going to pull that thing out and go, hey, remember that time you did this? Remember how crazy that was? Remember how stupid you looked? We didn't have that. So it's really easy for us to go, oh, wow, those TikTok witches. But here's the thing that this is the hill, as we say, that I'm willing to die on. If you don't practice witchcraft, you're not a witch, period.
Yeah.
And if you, all you do, and you and I are both authors, bless them. I want them to buy our books and read them and maybe get something from them that will help in their practice. But the most important thing is to practice. Practice.
A book will only take you so far, and you have to really work the book if you want it to take you to a really good place for that. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize, reading a book is not the same thing as working a book. There's a very real difference. You can read material, but not really work it. And that's true of any kind of book, magic or otherwise. And the same thing with anything else. Yeah, I mean, I definitely did some dumb stuff when I was a teenager and early 20-something. I mean, I've done some dumb stuff now. I mean, I'm in my mid 40s, and so I don't think it's
dumb stuff. That's
it's a human condition. I don't think that you can I don't think you can escape from it.
I think it says something about, I don't know, levels of curiosity, which I think are really important if you're practicing magic. But just being curious about, well, what if I did this thing? What would happen? What is the worst thing that could happen? And sometimes we may not know the worst thing that can happen until we conjure it up and it happens to us. But I think for the most part, that sort of hold my beer, I want to try something, is the very best kind of magic to practice, because you're learning new things, and you're really pushing the envelope of what you think of as standard practice. And the more we push at the edges, the better we're going to be, and the stronger we're going to be, and the more connected we're going to be. So I think it's important, even if we look stupid doing it.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said for doing some spontaneous magical work and just seeing where it takes you. It may not always go the way you expected, but sometimes that's the way you learn best. Yeah.
Well, it's the way I learn best, for sure. I mean, there are lessons. I'm 65 now. There are lessons that I had one just a couple months ago that it came up, and I was like, I thought I learned that. I thought I've learned that lesson about 4 or 5 times, but obviously I have not yet learned that lesson. So I think,
or maybe you learned it one way, but you didn't learn it another way.
Or maybe I didn't recognize it the next time it happened.
Yeah.
What? Oh, is that thing again? Yeah. But I think we have to always just keep learning and trying new stuff. So it's the big objection I have right now to the aesthetic of witchcraft. So it's fine if you want to dress in whatever you believe is a witchy way. I mean, I'm dressed in black from head to toe today. You apparently may also be in black.
I am. We're gothing it.
Exactly. I have on heavy black eyeliner, and I've got a do-rag on my head. And that's kind of standard operating procedure, I'm sorry to say. But I match that with the non-aesthetic of, I practice witchcraft all the time. And I'm amazed at the people who don't understand simple practical magic. Because it seems to me, it's like learning to write when we first learned with the great big pencil, and we do the great big letters on the lined paper. And maybe kids don't do that anymore, I don't know. But the big fat lined paper, and you do them really big, and then they get smaller. And at some point, maybe you learn cursive. But it's the same way with magic. If you don't start with those basic steps, if you don't first pick up a pencil and put it onto the paper, you can't get it. Well, maybe you can get there, but it's really, really hard. And what's the point of that?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I have too many people who say to me, like, I'm a huge believer in grounding and shielding. And they'll go, oh, you don't understand. I can't ground. It's too hard. I'm an air sign. I couldn't possibly ground. Well, then you try harder. Then you work harder. Then you find a different protocol that works better for you than the one I just taught you. But don't tell me you can't ground, because everybody can ground. We are creatures of the earth. Sit up. Don't even go there.
I love that. No, I think too. I mean, there's something to be said for just like cut the excuses. You know, it's very easy to make excuses and say, okay, I'm this or I'm that or whatever. But it's like, okay, well, why are you identifying with that so much? Why are you letting that define you to the point that you're not seeing what the options are around you? You know, there's something very real to be said about the limitations that people deal with, that they self-impose upon themselves.
Yes, the limitations that they kind of love. Somehow that limitation gives them, I don't know, gives them some juice that they really like. It's like, oh, no, I couldn't possibly do whatever that is because of this thing over here. When what would happen to us as humans, not just as magicians, but what would happen to us as humans if we just said, I do not accept these limitations. I don't. So I'm going to figure out how I find the wiggle room there. And no, I might never be able to stand on the roof of my house and fly.
Mm-hmm.
But what about that is what I want? Do I want the power of that? Do I want the simple locomotion of that? What is it about that I want? Can I figure out what my desire is and go from there? So I love to pick apart puzzles, and I love to encourage people to figure out what the base is. What's the thing at the bottom? What's the foundation? What's the grounding of whatever it is?
I feel similar way in regards to puzzles and problems and things like that. I like to solve problems. I like to take things apart and put them back together again. And I think to do that, you do have to have a really good foundation. You know, you can't operate out of a void. You know, there's got to be something in place that really informs what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you got there. So that's really important. One of the things you mentioned earlier, and I want to kind of circle back around to it, is you said, you know, you're continuing to dig around the roots of your practice. So you could talk a little bit about that and what that means.
Well, about 100 years ago, a little bit more, people came into the southern highlands of Appalachia, and they would hear traditional ballad singers, and they'd hear traditional music. And these people from outside would go, wait, I know that song. That's a traditional English folk song. That's child ballad number 714. And then they started tracking some of this folk music back to its roots. I decided I wanted to be, and they call themselves song catchers. So I decided I wanted to be a spell catcher. And I wanted to try to track some of this Appalachian folk magic back to its roots.
Mm-hmm.
So I go every few years. I mean, I haven't post-pandemic, but I used to go every 2 or 3 years to the border between England and Scotland and do field research, basically. I spent time with a community of Pennsylvania Dutch people in Pennsylvania, learning from them. And so it's been really interesting to dig into those roots. I've spent time with traditional Cherokee practitioners here. And those are the 3 main influences on this particular folk magic. And it's been fascinating to try to winkle out what is a folk practice that every culture has and does.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that eggs are an imitation of life and they hold life. I've not found a culture that doesn't follow that. And the folk magic shows that up. But what are the things that are peculiar in particular to this folk magic so that I can say, oh, that came from that place? One of the songs that I grew up with is called the Song of the Churn. Mm-hmm. And it's a women's folk song that is also a work song. and it's also a magical spell.
Mm.
So the rhythm of it is the rhythm of churning by hand, old-fashioned churning. But the words of the song are about this precious commodity cream turning into a more precious commodity, butter, and stiffening up. And in our culture we call it when the butter comes. So it used to be cream, and when the butter comes, it solidifies. So there are a lot of different versions of that, but it all has that same rhythm, the same churning rhythm, and the same sort of magical incantation quality. I originally found it in the work of Alexander Carmichael. He gathered it in about 1842, but I continued to track it back to some children's songs in the 1500s.
Oh, wow.
So I was hanging out with my Dutch friends and looking through some of their books. And I went, "Oh, Song of the Churn. Don't you love that one?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, no, that's one of ours." And I went, "Like hell it is. I've tracked it back to England to 1545. So we had to laugh. So it's interesting to try to figure out, and it's any folklorist work to figure out what is something that springs spontaneously in a folk tradition, across folk traditions, and what is specific to a tradition that may have traveled in a diaspora to a new place. So it's fascinating work. I'll never finish it. If I had started it when I was 16, I still would never finish it. But I love it. It's really, really interesting. And I've met so many amazing people.
Your passion shows through. I love it. That's great. I mean, I imagine one challenge with that too is, I mean, you've got the written records, but tracing it back to the oral records is really, I would think it would really be the challenge, because of course oral history changes, and not only that, but you've got the simple fact that a lot of times it fades away if nobody gets around to writing it.
Well, the story I tell often when I'm teaching is that the father of my best friend from high school, who is still a very good friend of mine, he said to me at his wife's funeral, he said, "Well, Miss Byron, I know you understand about this kind of stuff, but now I'm the seventh son of a seventh son. What am I supposed to know?" And seventh son of a seventh son, or seventh daughter of a seventh daughter, is like Appalachian royalty. They are like the most magical and mystical of the magical, mystical people, but it's an oral tradition. So I said to him, "I don't know what you're supposed to know. Your father should have told you." And his response was, "Well, he tried to talk to me, but all I really wanted to do was drink liquor and play the mandolin." Well, now, he ended up being a fabulous musician, extraordinary musician, but that line of information is broken, and it is forever broken. Now, he may have not had anything that some other family didn't have, but we won't ever know that because the oral tradition is broken.
Yeah.
And we don't know what all we've lost because of that, because of the Appalachian diaspora. There are no jobs. People are ashamed to be from the region. And so they move away, and they're going to forget all that country stuff. And then 2 or 3 generations later, the great grandchildren want to know, so was there anybody in our family who practiced this folk magic? They don't know, because the tradition's broken.
That's sad.
It is sad.
Because you can't get it back.
Maybe you can.
How?
Through trial and error,
Mm-hmm.
through reading about what other families have done. And it may be that you get to the point, as we talked about earlier, where you get to the point where there is a calling. Maybe you understand lots of blood remedies. And so there's a calling in you. You've heard of this thing, this stopping the flow of blood thing, but you don't feel like you have the gift for it, but you are being drawn into that kind of, that's where your curiosity goes. And so it may be that you will come upon that. It may be that it's something that is part of your blood lineage, and you will, through experimentation, through dream work, you might get it back. I don't know. possible. I hate to believe anything's lost forever. And I think the rules of thermodynamical magic say nothing's ever lost. Is that right?
Yeah. And
Oh,
I
man.
mean, I would think too that, I mean, if there was a way to work with like the spirits of I mean, since there's ways to work with the spirits of the land or the spirits of the ancestors, that you could probably get some of that information that way. You'd have to test it, of course, and you're dealing with, you know, unverified personal gnosis, as people like to put out there. But it definitely takes some work. And you just, I would think, you know.
Yeah, no, it does. And there's simple things people can do. If you think there's a folk magic tradition in your family, don't ask your eldest relatives if their grandmother was a witch. Just don't use that kind of language, because an awful lot of people will immediately shut down. But if you say to your eldest living relative, what were those weird superstitious things our family did? Then you're going to hear all kinds of stuff. And if you are versed at all in magical practice, you're going to know, oh, the women always tied a red string around their left wrist when somebody was going to have a baby. Huh, that's really interesting. Do you remember anything else about that? No, that's all I remember. That great grandma always had red embroidery thread, and that's what we always did with it. So you can start to piece together different things from your family that they might not even at the time have considered magical practice. Because the other thing about this particular folk magic is that traditional practitioners don't believe they hold the power and authority, that they do the magic. They are vessels for the will of spirit. And so I had a great aunt who I never met, but she was somebody who could remove warts. And she would say right up front, and it's kind of formulaic. She would say right up front, oh, I don't have any power to do that. I don't know why people come to me about that. And then she would take whatever the affected body part was, and she would rub it with her thumb while she asked about your family. So how's your mama doing? How's the new baby? Rub, rub, rub. And then there would come a point where she would remove her hands. And 3 days later is the family story, the wart would fall off.
Wow.
Now, what we don't know is, was there something in the chemicals of the oil of her skin that interfered with the virus that causes warts? That seems logical. I don't know how you would go about doing an experiment about that, but that makes sense. And how much of it is that everyone expected that they went to her, she did the wart thing and their warts fell off. And so they themselves interfered with the virus and the wart fell off. So there's some of that stuff too that we have to look at with a modern eye of science, but also knowing that these people believed in the abilities that they had, and we have plenty of proof that they often worked, but they also didn't particularly feel like they held a monopoly on it, that they were just letting spirit work through them. And for most of them, because they were Protestant Christians, they were talking about the Holy Spirit, or they were talking about Jesus. And they just let Jesus work through them. They were just a vessel, just a channel for spirit. That also, in a way, protected them, didn't it? That they were prophets, that they were people that were connected on a different level to this divine power.
It reminds me of mediation. When we talk about not mediation in the sense of, you know, you have people meeting and you have a mediator arbitrating, but rather the spiritual concept of mediation, where you're letting spirit work through you. I mean, it's basically the same thing. So, you know, you're opening yourself up and you're letting it work through you, and you're not necessarily trying to control it so much as you're flowing with it and allowing it to take you where you need to go and do the work you need to do. Which I think is interesting, because when you look at a lot of modern occultism, the focus is more on will. You know, we're going to use my willpower in order to get this thing. I'm going to try and force this stuff together. And I'm not saying results-based magic doesn't work. I mean, I've certainly done enough of it that it can work. But I also think that there is something to be said for working in a way where you're really allowing spirit to work through you and to transform the experience, and not necessarily trying to come in with an overt agenda, but really just being open to how it shows up in your life.
Oh, absolutely. And if you're thinking about sort of a family tradition that we may have broken the lineage somewhere, then working with ancestors that you maybe actually knew, or the generation before the ones you knew, and being very direct with them. So I need to know how this was accomplished, and here is my physicality for you to use.
Mhm.
And if you will let me dream of the list of ingredients I need to have on the kitchen table, that'd be helpful. But okay, here we go. And there are just so many ways to practice what we do. And there are so many ways to learn what we do. But the learning and the practicing are vitally important if we are going to call ourselves what we call ourselves.
So if someone wants to learn a folk magic tradition, but they're not part of a lineage, can they? I know you have the books, but that's, it's still not, I mean, it's still a question I think anyone watching this would ask, well,
Yeah,
I'm not
absolutely.
necessarily part of a lineage, but this is interesting. Can I learn it?
I'm going to say yes and no. They're Pisces. I'm on the fence. I'm on the fence because I'm a Pisces. I think that if you are respectful of a particular tradition and respectful of the people who currently practice it, then you probably can.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to come in, and the phrase that I use that came to me from a traditional storyteller named Marilyn McMinn McCready, the phrase that I use is cultural strip mining. So if you are coming in to learn Appalachian folk magic because it's a day in the sun right now, I mean, face it, it's hot. It's a hot thing to do. It's a hot commodity. If you're going in because that's the latest cool magic to learn, it's probably not going to do much for you. But if you are, I have found that it's particularly effective for people who are part of what I call the Appalachian diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And their family left the region 2, 3, 4 generations ago. And they still have a kind of a link, somehow an energetic link to the area. I find those people are very, very good at the folk magic. But I'm not saying other people can't learn it, because I think they can. But I would encourage people to look at the folk magic of their own culture,
mm-hmm.
and to see, to find what's intriguing about that. And you find that folk magic, even if it's white bread suburbia, you find that by doing what I said earlier, which is talking to your eldest elders and finding out what the weird superstitions are. And then you go, and then maybe you Google it, wearing a red string on the left wrist when a member of the family is pregnant. And then suddenly you realize that's a Slovak tradition. And then you say, hey, were any of our family from Czechoslovakia? Oh yeah, great grandpa came here as a shoe cobbler. And then not only are you going to be able to ground yourself in those familial traditions, but you're going to be able to learn the folk magic that maybe is going to work for you better. I don't know. It's a really tough question, because I think we often, and I'm going to put quotes around we often find some magical practices and techniques really appealing. And then we want to go in and we want to have that piece right there. I want to have that, without really acknowledging the culture it comes out of. And I think that's I have an ethical problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I will also say this. So here I am, one hand left. Here's the one hand, and on the other hand, and on the third hand is this: is that I have loved my opportunities to sit with other folk magicians and compare notes. And there are things that I have taken out of other people's folk traditions, like brick dust, redding. We don't have that in my tradition, but it's such a wonderful tool. And when I learned about it from several different root workers who used it, I specifically said, so could I do that? And they went, oh yeah, no, it works great, try it. And so that's a piece of it too, is that you try it and you see if it works for you. And it may be that folk magic technique won't work for you because you're not really connecting with it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a good example of trial and error and experimentation in a way. You're still working with a foundation, but you're also trying to figure out like what really resonates and what works with you, which I think is absolutely essential
Yeah.
to the magical practice. This comes to my next question, and this is kind of an iteration of the previous one, but it's also a little bit different. Can somebody start their own folk lineage? You have this, they start to do some of this research and they find some things, but can they actually start something and then so that they can transmit it on to somebody down the line?
Why not? One of our ancestors did that.
Right.
Now, I think it would be really, really hard to create an entire folk tradition in one lifetime. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, there are things that you can try and do they work. And this is what I'm going to do. And I always, because at heart, I'm an animist. And I always go back to nature. What's happening in nature? How does nature deal with that problem? What example does the natural world give me about the situation that I'm in right now? But I don't think there's any reason that you right now could start your own folk practice. And then your grandchildren or your students of your students would look back and go, oh, yeah, it's the Ellwood thing. You remember he did that cool thing and he would take 3 sticks and he would tie them together with a piece of rope. Remember, and that was like the blessing sticks. Remember, we still do the Ellwood blessing sticks. They're amazing magic.
Ellwood blessing sticks. There you go. Yeah, I love it.
Ellwood blessing sticks.
Well, just again, if you want to share where people can find you on the web and what the title of your books are.
Sure. Oh, can I go through all the titles? Let's see if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
Aspidity and Madstones. Oh, sorry, that's not the first one. Stalbs and Ditchwater, Aspidity and Madstones. And then I wrote a book called Embracing Willendorf, A Witch's Way to Loving Your Body to Health and Fitness, which is Weight Watchers. It's about listening to your body and giving it what it needs, what you need. Then my 4th book is called Earthworks, Ceremonies in Tower Time. And it's a book of, the first half is essays about cultural collapse. And the last half of the book is all ceremonies about how you can ceremonialize the collapse of Western culture. My most recent 2 books, both came out this year. Llewellyn did Roots, Branches, and Spirits, The Folkways and Witchery of Appalachia. And then in August, which it still has new book smell, this one, it's Seasons of a Magical Life. And it's all about following the cycle of the seasons to deepen your spirituality.
Oh, very cool.
And they can find me at myvillagewitch.com, at Facebook as Byron Ballard. Twitter, I'm Byron Ballard, and Instagram, I am unsurprisingly Byron Ballard.
There you go. And any final thoughts for us?
Practice, practice, practice. Practice doesn't make perfect, but practice makes a powerful magician. And right now, as we are watching the collapse of systems within our culture, I won't say the whole culture is collapsing, but systems are collapsing. The more powerful and adept you are at magic, the more likely it is our species is going to survive, and that's just a fact. So practice it all the time. It's like Doritos. Practice all you want and then make more, because you don't get just a little bit of magic in your life. You get all the magic you can use. So use it for everything.
Oh, perfect. Love it. Well, thank you for coming on to the show. Really happy to have you here, and definitely we'll have to have you come back on again sometime. And it was just great getting to know you better.
Yes, absolutely. We are no longer ships passing in the night.
No longer.
It was so good talking to you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for your hospitality.